Hi guys, this is episode 2 of me trying to get to 1000 ELO on chess.com by the end of the summer. I'm going to be showing you guys some games in which I played in order to get to 700 ELO on chess.com. I hope you enjoy. Hi guys, this is one of the first games I played, and as you'll see later on, it didn't go so well. So we just started pretty standardly with the 4 knights defense. Then he set out his bishops to attack my knight, and that meant I was forced to move to d6, as if his bishop took, that means I'd have to take back, and that means he could just grab this free pawn using this knight. And so so I moved here, d6, then he castled. I tried to fianchetto since my bishop was now blocked, but I think this wasn't a very good idea. I think I should have just moved my bishop to f. I think I should just move my bishop to e7, because as you can see later on, the fianchetto caused a lot of weaknesses and problems. So anyway, he traded pieces, and he pushed his d pawn. And then I just ignored it because if I took, then my center would have been completely open. So I just pinned his knight to his queen. He took, I took, and we traded queens. And now, because his queen wasn't here, he could take this pawn. So I blundered that pawn, and I didn't see that he could also take this pawn. So I just decided to move my bishop, and so he took it. And I moved my rook forward, hoping to attack this pawn, but I still didn't see that he could attack, that he could take the a7 pawn. But also, I didn't realize that I just blundered my rook because I had tunnel vision, and so I was just thinking, oh, why do you try to attack the second rank and attack these pawns? So I tunnel visioned, and I forgot that my opponent's bishop was there, and so I just blundered my rook, which was a big mistake. So I castled. He pushed his pawn, trying to attack my knight, and I think that was one of the only spaces my knight could have moved to. His knight came in. I thought he was trying to go for an attack here or here, like trying to check my king. So I moved my knight to c5, but I think I should have moved my king here so he wouldn't be able to check me. He moved his bishop, so if he ever moves his pawn, my bishop will be attacked. So I pushed my pawn to h5 because I wanted to make room for my bishop and knight. So he checks me. I move there, and he pushes his pawn. Just as I said, he's going to start attacking my bishop now. And I shouldn't trade because I'm a rook down. I just take the pawn because he actually blundered it. As you can see, he's preparing for an attack by moving this rook. I moved my bishop because I didn't want him to trade bishops. I didn't want him to trade bishops with me, as I'm a rook down. He checks me again. That's my only safe square, I think. And then he takes my bishop. I move back because when he takes, I'm in check. And then he checks me again. He takes my pawn. He checks me again, and I'm stuck in this loop where he just gobbles up all my pieces. And then he takes my rook. I take back, but I am completely lost here because I take his knight, and then he could move. Then he could check my king using his rook, and it's forced checkmate because my only safe square is g8, and then it's checkmate. I played this game right after the previous game I showed you, and this game also didn't go so well. So I started with e4, e5, knight f3, like a normal game, until my opponent played d5. I wasn't really sure what to do. Like, I wasn't sure whether to take or to just ignore it or to take the pawn. But back then I decided to just ignore it and develop my knight. And then after that, he took my pawn, and then I took back. And then my opponent pinned my knight to my queen. And so I blocked the pin, and we traded. And then my opponent pushes f5 pawn. I'm not sure. Then I moved my knight to g3. I'm not sure why I moved there. I think it would have been better to move here, as now my opponent could still like push his pawn, and I lose like time and the initiative. So that's what my opponent did, and I moved back to the center. And then my opponent just decided to develop his knight. Also, I think I missed a chance to take this pawn, and that's just a free pawn. And if my opponent tried to move here, and I could just take back. And well, my opponent could have moved here, but a bishop for a rook, and and then when I take, my opponent would probably take this knight, then I could escape. Okay, so yeah, I missed that chance. That would have been a pretty good move. But anyway, I moved my knight back to the center, and my opponent developed his knight. And then I pushed my c pawn because I was thinking of moving this pawn forward into the center. My opponent develops his queen to h4, and he's trying to target this square, this pawn, and this pawn and like this square was a major weakness for me for like the rest of the game. I pushed a pawn to d4 because I was hoping to like open up the center and maybe let my bishop out somehow. My opponent castled, and I decided to take his e5 pawn. I think that was a mistake because it would have been fine if I kept the tension in the center, and me taking the pawn allowed him to get, like, me taking the pawn allowed his rook to get a like semi-open file basically, and also allowed my opponent to win a free pawn through a discovered attack. So he takes, and his rook's attacking my queen. After that, I made another mistake in which I blocked the bishop. I think this was wrong because it's pinning the bishop to my queen. So that's why it's wrong. I think I did that just to develop it, but it was still a mistake. I think it should have been my queen here to just develop it, or here. Or I could have moved my queen over here because I had ideas of like trying to form an attack by taking this pawn and maybe using this light squared bishop or my bishops. But anyway, I blocked my bishop, and then my opponent decided to check me, and that I had to move my king, and that meant I couldn't castle. And then my opponent decided to move his bishop here, which further targeted this pawn. This pawn only has my king and my knight defending it, while my opponent has his queen, king, and bishop attacking this pawn. So to try to stop the attack, I decided to push my g3 pawn, and my opponent took that pawn, and I took with the h pawn, which attacked his queen. Then once my opponent moved back, I decided to skewer his rook and queen. I thought this would be a really good move and I definitely get a free rook. However, I didn't see that my opponent could just block with his knight. And now there were two threats. One, I didn't see the threat on my knight, but there was one, my opponent could take my knight with his knight, and two, my opponent could fork my queen and rook using this knight. I only saw this attack with this knight. I didn't see that I had blundered my knight, and so I decided to move my bishop back. I decided to move my bishop back, which was a mistake because if I hadn't have done that, I wouldn't have lost this knight as it was pinned. So I moved my bishop back, and then I just blundered my knight. And after that, I just moved my queen. It was basically just a time waste move. I wasn't really sure what to do. And then we traded bishops. And as you can see here, the position around my king is completely destroyed. And I'm a whole minor piece down, which already gives me a massive disadvantage. Then my opponent moves his knight to f2, which is a huge pain because it's a knight pair, and so the knight pair is really strong, and also attacks my rook. So I moved my rook to a h4. I was hoping to get it more active in the game. But then I realized, I also blundered my pawn, and so as you can see, I'm getting absolutely destroyed. I tried to check my opponent's king. I wasn't sure what to do, so that's the only thing I thought to do. And then my opponent just moved it away. I wasn't sure what to do in this position, so I just moved my bishop back. And then my opponent brings his other rook into the game. And this meant my opponent could cause a discovered attack of some sort, because my king was right behind my opponent's knight. So I wasn't sure what I was trying to do. I think by moving this rook, I thought I could I thought maybe I could. Yeah, I thought I was gonna trap this knight and hopefully just win back the minor piece. But my opponent decided to discovered attack, check me, and my only move was to move to g2, and then my opponent checked me with his queen on f2. And then I moved into the corner. I think I should have moved my king to h3, though I was gonna get checkmated anyway. So I moved my king back into the corner. Then my opponent checkmates me. So yeah, this game was horrible, but the other games I'm gonna show you are much better. This is the third game I'm going to show you guys, and I actually won this game unlike the previous two. So I started with e4, and my opponent played e5, knight f3, just like the last game. But then my opponent played bishop to c5, and that just blunders this central pawn. So I took the pawn, and then my opponent moved her queen to f6, threatening checkmate by taking this pawn. And I think my opponent was hoping that I just take the sacrifice and ignore the checkmate, or not be able to see it. But I saw it, so I moved my knight back to block her queen's view of this pawn. Then after my opponent pushed her pawn to g5, and I think she was going to push this pawn one square forward in her next move to try to kick this knight out, and so she'd be able to checkmate me. However, to stop this, I pushed my d pawn to d4, which attacked her bishop and also blocked the bishop's view to this pawn. So my opponent moved her bishop back, and then I attacked her queen, and then my opponent moved her queen to e6, which leaves this pawn hanging, so I just take the pawn of the bishop, and my opponent pushes the f6 pawn, trying to get my bishop to back off. But I thought that this was a blunder and that this was a free pawn, so I took the pawn. But after that, my opponent takes back, and in the game I now realize that I just lost the bishop, because I can't take back because this pawn is pinned to my king, and so if I take, my king will be in check. So I just blundered the bishop. So after that I just developed my knight. I wasn't sure what to do, and then my opponent moved her knight to d5. I pinned my opponent's knight to her queen, hoping to win back like a minor piece, but my opponent decided to just defend it with her pawn. After I decided to attack my opponent's queen, and she moved it forward to a f5, and then I checked her king. So my opponent moved her king forward. I think it would have been better if my opponent moved her king to a d8, since moving it to e7 just brings it out into the open and vulnerable. So I developed my knight to e4, and now this square, this square, this square, this square, and this square are all covered by my pieces, and so my opponent's king could only move to d8 and f8, or f8. So after that, my opponent decided to take my pawn, which was hanging, and then I decided that I didn't see that this pawn was hanging too, so I decided to castle, because I didn't want my king to be out in the open in case of an attack. So I castled, blundering my e5 pawn also. Then after that, I just moved my rook into the center to hopefully create an attack on this file. And then I didn't realize that this pawn was also undefended, so my opponent decided to take this pawn. However, this ended up being a mistake, as I had a discovered attack. So I moved my knight back to g3, which checked her king and also attacked her queen. So my opponent moved her king to f6, and I just took her queen. And now that my opponent's king took the knight, I could also create another discovered attack by moving my knight to f7, which checks her king and also attacks her rook. So my opponent moves her king back to f6, and then I decided to check her king. I'm not sure why I just didn't take the rook, though. I think that would have been a better move. So then my opponent moves her king back to g7, and then I try to attack her bishop, and then she moved her bishop back. I'm not sure why I just didn't take the rook. Maybe I thought of an attack of some sorts. So my opponent moved her bishop to f6, and I decided to trade minor pieces. So yeah, and then I moved my knight to d6. I think the reason I didn't take her rook was that I thought that if I took her rook, my knight would be taken, and I wouldn't have the resources to checkmate her as quick. But now I realise that my thinking was wrong, because if she takes, my queen could take her bishop, which would give her king check, and then I could just checkmate her by moving my rook to e8. So that was my mistake. I could have ended this game a lot earlier, but I didn't. So I moved my knight back, and then my opponent just develops her knight. Then I check my opponent, and she moves back, and then I just give her checkmate by moving my rook to e8. So that game went a lot better than the previous two, and I'm pretty sure the next few games we're going to show you also went better. This was the penultimate game until I finally broke the 700 euro boundary on chess.com, and I think it went pretty well. So I started with e4, and my opponent played d5. I'm not really sure what to do in the situation, so if you know, please put it down in the comments. But I just took the pawn, and he took back with his queen. So I just developed my knight, and my opponent checked me, so I blocked with my bishop. After that, my opponent developed his knight to f6, and I just pushed my d pawn to get back control of the center. And then my opponent just pushed his knight to e4. I think he was trying to form an attack, but this was quite annoying because he was attacking these squares. So I just developed my bishop. I didn't want to develop my bishop here or here because it had no real use there. So I just decided to support my center even more by putting my bishop on e3. And then my opponent put his queen on g4, which attacks this pawn. So I pushed my bishop back to f1, and then he pushed his pawn to e5. I just ignored it because I don't know why I ignored it. That was my mistake. I should have taken it. So yeah. Anyway, it was my mistake. So I ignored it, and I just developed my bishop to c3, and then my opponent pinned my knight to my king, using her bishop. I tried to push his bishop back, but he just decided to trade. And then neither me or my opponent noticed that this was undefended and was being attacked by the black. It was being attacked by my opponent's knight. So my opponent just castled, and I just tried to push my opponent's queen out of this area. And then I noticed, this one was being attacked by this knight. So I moved my queen to d3, which also attacked the knight. And after that, my opponent decided to move her queen to c6, which defended the knight and also put pressure on this pawn. So to help support this pawn, I moved my bishop back to d2. And then my opponent just decided to trade minor pieces and also trade pawns in the center. And then I took back with my knight, which attacked my opponent's queen. But my opponent decided to just check me instead. So I blocked the knight, and then my opponent moves to g6. Last time I castled, since I didn't like my king being in the center and so prone to attacks through these two files. So I castled, and then my opponent moved to a4. I didn't notice that that this pawn was being attacked by the queen, so I just decided to move my queen back to e1, and then my opponent took that pawn with a check. I thought about moving to b1, but I But then I realized that my king would just be always under attack, so I decided to move it more towards this side. And so I moved my king to d2. My opponent checked me again, but then I blocked the knight. And then my opponent tried to put pressure on the knight by pushing his pawn to c5. So I just ignored the threat since there was nothing I could do about it, I thought. And so I moved my queen to e7, which put pressure on his position and also attacked my opponent's rook. So after that, my opponent moved his knight to c6, which defended his rook and attacked my queen. Then I moved my king back. I'm not sure why I did that, because I think I just blundered my queen. But my opponent didn't see that. So, so he took my knight, which left his queen out in the open, and so I could take his queen with my queen. Then after that, my opponent gave me another check. I blocked with the bishop, and my opponent took the c3 pawn. But I didn't really care at this point, since I knew I was going to win. I took back, and my opponent tried to push his b5 pawn. I just moved my king to safety by moving it to f1. And then my opponent moved his knight to e5. I took the pawn, which I then realized was undefended, which also attacked my opponent's rook. My opponent moved out the way, and I moved my rook to e1, which pinned his knight to his rook. So my opponent just moved his bishop to b7, and I took his knight, which was just free knight, and he traded rooks. After that, my opponent moved his rook to f8, which I think that was just a last-ditch effort to defend his king. So I just pushed my pawn because I was trying to create an opening within these pawns so I could checkmate. My opponent pushes f pawn, which attacks my queen, and so I just gave my opponent a check, and so he got trapped in a corner. I pushed my pawn again, and he took, and this meant that his kingside position was completely open. So I took back. My opponent moved his rook to g8. I checked my opponent. My opponent blocked, and then I moved my bishop to c4 to attack this square. So I could try checkmate. Then my opponent just decided to check me, last-ditch effort. Then my opponent pushed his h pawn, but I just checked. But I just took the pawn and it was checkmate. So I won that game, but I made quite a lot of blunders and mistakes. This game was the final game until I finally reached 700 ELO on chess.com. And I made some mistakes, but overall I think it was a really good game. Compared to my other ones anyway. So let's just get started. My opponent played d4. This meant I couldn't play the Sicilian, which is what I like to do. So I just played d5. Then my opponent played knight f3. So I developed my bishop to f5. My opponent developed his knight to c3, which attacked my pawn. So I moved my knight to f6. And my opponent pushed his pawn to h3, which in his position I wouldn't have done. I understand he's trying to prevent me from going here, but in my opinion, I think it would have been better to develop his bishop maybe or something like that. But this isn't a bad move either. So I I moved to e5. I'm not sure why I did this. I thought, oh, let's try to open up the center or something like that. But I didn't realize that I just blundered my pawn. So my opponent took with his knight. And then I decided to push the c5 pawn, actually trying to open up the center. Instead of taking, which I'd hoped my opponent would do, my opponent pushed his pawn to g4, which attacks my bishop. So I moved my bishop to e6 to help support this pawn. My opponent moved his pawn to e3, and then I just took his central pawn. He took back, and then I developed my bishop to d6, which targeted my opponent's knight. And then my opponent moved his bishop to g2, and I think it's good that I moved my bishop here because now my opponent's attacking his pawn with 2 pieces. But lucky, I'm defending it with 2 pieces also. So yeah, I developed my knight to c6, attacking this pawn. But then my opponent decided to trade knights, and then my opponent decided to castle. And my opponent's pawn structure around his king is quite weak, so I pushed my h pawn to h5 to try and open it up. My opponent, instead of taking, developed his bishop, which pinned my knight to my queen. And so I just ignored that threat and I took my opponent's pawn. My opponent, instead of taking back, my opponent pushed his pawn, which blocked my rook from accessing this file, which was quite annoying. So after that, I moved my queen to c7, which backs up my bishop and was strengthening this diagonal. Well, that was my thinking anyway. So I think it was to block my bishop's view. My opponent moved his pawn to f4, and then after that, I pushed my knight into the center by moving it to e4, and also this move, pawn to f4, it also blocked in my opponent's bishop. So my thinking was, when I move this knight, I can push this pawn forward and take my opponent's bishop. So my opponent traded knight for knight in the center, and then my opponent moved his queen to d2, and then I attacked his bishop, and now, as you can see, it's fully blocked in, so it's free bishop. After that, my opponent moved his rook to e1, which is the same file as my king, so that was a bit of a threat. But I just took the bishop, and my opponent took with his h pawn, which I think was I'm not sure if that was the best option. I think it would have been the best option, since taking with the f pawn could have opened up this diagonal for my bishop. So anyway, my opponent took with his h pawn, and I decided to push this pawn, which basically trapped the king, as this pawn covered this square and this square, and my rook covered this file. So I didn't notice that this pawn was undefended, so my opponent just took this pawn, and it's also created an attack on this bishop. And this bishop was also pinned to my king, so that was a big threat. So I castled, and I didn't see that this bishop was undefended at the time of the game, so I castled and just lost the bishop, which wasn't very good. So I just moved my rook onto the f file because I was trying to win this pawn, and my opponent pushed it. So after that, I wasn't sure what to do. So I moved my rook to h2, trying to create a threat. I wasn't sure what I was doing. Then my opponent just pushed his pawn to c4, and I moved my king to b8. I'm not sure what was the point of that move. I don't really know why I made that move. My opponent pushed his pawn to c5, which attacked my bishop, and the only I didn't see I could go here, so instead I just moved my bishop to f4, and as you can see, there's 2 attackers on the square, but only 1 defender. So my opponent took my bishop. So I wasn't sure what to do, so I just doubled my rooks, trying to create a checkmate opportunity. And then my opponent decided to check me. As you can see here, my opponent had a big advantage. If you look at the evaluation bar. So I just moved my king out of the way, and my opponent decided to move his king to f1. And as you can see, the black on the evaluation bar has skyrocketed, and it says mate in 9. I obviously didn't see that mate in 9, but that's good. And I think that's because when my opponent checked me, he stopped defending this rook. So as you can see here, his queen was defending this rook, but when he checked me, when I moved, he didn't move his rook. I didn't think he saw that his rook was being attacked, so he just moved his king. And that was when I was starting to win. Since I took his rook, he moved his king to e2, and that meant I could take his bishop. His king moved to d3. I took his pawn, giving him check, and forking his king and rook. He blocked the rook, which is a good solution to the fork. But then I moved my other rook also on the second rank. My opponent moved to c4, but he was kind of trapped to this area since this pawn covered this square and this square. And also this left his rook undefended, so I could just take his rook. He moved his queen, maybe trying to create a threat or something, like a last-ditch effort. So then I decided to check him. My opponent moved his king to b4. I checked him again. My opponent moved his king. I checked him again. And I delivered checkmate. So yeah, I made a blunder. I think in all of these games, I made quite big blunders. I'm gonna practice more to stop making as many blunders. But other than that, I actually won this game, and I finally got up to 700 elo, which is really good. Anyway, guys, please like and subscribe if you want to see the next episode, which is when I'll get up to 800 elo on chess.com.